The total was sobering. Over the past 2 years, I'd given them nearly $20,000 in various loans and gifts. The requests were becoming more frequent and larger. Bobby would call with a crisis tone in his voice, explaining how they'd tried everything else but really needed help just this once. Linda would mention casually how much easier life would be if they could consolidate their credit card debt or make a down payment on a better house. The grandchildren would visit with stories about job interviews that required new clothes or educational opportunities that needed funding. I wanted to believe it was temporary, that once they got back on their feet financially, things would return to normal. I wanted to believe that my value to them extended beyond my bank account, that they visited because they loved me and enjoyed my company, not just because I was a reliable source of emergency funding. My Medicare card lived in my wallet between my driver's license and my Costco membership card. It was just a piece of plastic to me, something I handed over at doctor's appointments and picked up from the counter afterward without much thought. I trusted the healthcare system, trusted that the charges on my Medicare statements were accurate reflections of the care I'd received. Every month, the statements would arrive in my mailbox along with the utility bills and grocery store flyers. I'd glance at them briefly, checking that my regular appointments were listed correctly, then file them away in the accordion folder Harold had set up years ago for medical records. The numbers meant little to me as long as my out-of-pocket costs remained manageable. Dr. Rodriguez, my primary care physician, had offices in a modern medical complex near the Scottsdale airport. I saw him every 3 months for diabetes management and an annual physical that was thorough but routine. He was a kind man in his 50s who remembered details about my quilting and always asked about Dot. His office staff knew me by name and had my information in their system, making appointments smooth and efficient. The cardiology visits were newer, starting after Harold's death when Dr. Rodriguez decided I should be monitored as a precaution. Dr. Patel was younger and more technical than Dr. Rodriguez, explaining things with charts and diagrams that I didn't always understand but appreciated nonetheless. Those visits involved more tests, EKGs and stress tests and blood work that generated more paperwork and more Medicare charges. I was grateful for good insurance, remembering the stories my mother used to tell about medical bills that could bankrupt a family. Harold and I had been careful about our health throughout our marriage, exercising regularly and eating well, but we'd seen too many friends devastated by cancer or heart disease to take anything for granted. Medicare felt like a safety net, protection against the kind of catastrophic costs that could wipe out everything we'd worked for. My daily routine was simple but satisfying. I'd wake up around 6, before the heat became unbearable, and spend an hour on my patio with coffee and the newspaper. The Arizona Republic was delivered to my door every morning, one of the few luxuries I maintained from my married life. I'd read the local news and work the crossword puzzle, watching the desert come alive as the sun climbed higher. Breakfast was usually oatmeal with fresh berries from the grocery store, along with my morning medications. The diabetes required careful attention to what I ate and when, but I developed a routine that kept my blood sugar stable without feeling restrictive. Harold had been a meat and potatoes man, so learning to cook for one had meant discovering foods I'd never tried before. The community center became my second home. Besides the quilting circle and book club, they offered exercise classes designed for seniors, lecture series on topics like desert gardening and financial planning, and social events that helped combat the isolation that could creep in during the long summer months when it was too hot to spend much time outdoors. Frank Martinez was a regular at many of the same activities. A retired postal worker whose wife had died 6 years earlier, he was one of those men who seemed genuinely interested in other people's lives and stories. We'd been acquaintances for over a year, chatting during the breaks at lectures or while waiting for classes to start, before he finally asked me to dinner at a restaurant near the community center. That first dinner had been surprisingly comfortable. Frank was a good listener, asking thoughtful questions about my quilting and my volunteer work without the glazed-over expression I'd gotten used to from my family. He told me about his 30 years delivering mail in Phoenix, the characters he'd met on his routes, and the travel he'd been doing since retirement. He had children too, a daughter in Seattle and a son in Denver, who called regularly but visited infrequently. We started meeting for coffee once a week, then dinner every Saturday night. Frank was respectful of my grief and my independence, never pushing for more than I was ready to give. He understood the particular challenges of starting over in your 70s, of building a new identity after decades of being part of a couple. When I mentioned Frank to Bobby during one of our phone calls, his reaction was immediate and negative. "Mom, you barely know this guy. How do you know he's not just interested in your money?" The question stung, partly because it echoed my own insecurities and partly because it revealed how Bobby saw me. Was I really so unlovable that no one could want my company for its own sake? Was my only value to people the financial security I represented? We just have dinner and go to lectures, I said defensively. He's a nice man who lost his wife. We understand each other. Just be careful, Bobby warned. There are a lot of scammers out there who target widows. Maybe Linda and I should meet him, just to make sure he's legitimate. I didn't invite them to meet Frank, and I didn't stop seeing him. For the first time in years, I was making a decision based on what I wanted rather than what my family thought was best for me. It felt both liberating and slightly terrifying. My financial situation was stable but not lavish. Harold's pension provided a modest monthly income, combined with our Social Security and the proceeds from selling our larger house after his death. I owned my condo outright and had savings that would last comfortably if I was careful. The money I'd been lending to Bobby's family was coming from those savings, slowly eroding the security Harold and I had worked so hard to build. Worried about this constantly. You're going to end up broke if you keep giving them money, she'd say during our weekly lunches. What happens when you need long-term care or have a medical emergency? That savings account isn't going to last forever. I knew she was right, but saying no to my family felt impossible. They were all I had left of my life with Harold, the only people who remembered me as anything other than a solitary widow. If I stopped being useful to them, would they stop visiting altogether? Would I end up completely alone, just another forgotten senior citizen in a community full of them? The guilt was constant. Guilt about having money when they were struggling, guilt about questioning their motives, guilt about disappointing them when they needed help. I'd raised Bobby to come to me with his problems, to trust that his mother would always be there for him. How could I suddenly start turning him away? But the money wasn't the only issue. It was the way they looked at me now, like I was a problem to be managed rather than a person to be loved. It was the impatience in their voices when I told stories they'd heard before, the way they'd exchange glances when they thought I wasn't looking. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I thought Medicare statements were boring paperwork until I saw charges for a ski resort medical clinic in Colorado. The problem? I haven't left Phoenix in 2 years, and I'm terrified of heights. That's when I realized my own family had been using my Medicare card like their personal vacation insurance policy, filing false claims every time they traveled. What they didn't know was that I'd been keeping secrets too, and mine were about to set me free. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Margaret Thompson, but everyone calls me Maggie. At 72, I've learned that life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it, and not always in pleasant ways. I live in a modest 2-bedroom condo in Scottsdale, Arizona, in one of those 55-plus communities where the streets have names like Desert Bloom and Sunset Ridge. It's the kind of place where your biggest decision is whether to attend water aerobics at 9 or 10 in the morning, and where the mailboxes are designed to look like tiny adobe houses. 4 years ago, when my husband Harold passed away from a sudden heart attack, I thought my world had ended. We'd been married for 47 years, and suddenly I was navigating everything alone for the first time since I was 23. Harold had always handled the finances, the insurance, the big decisions. I was the one who managed the household, worked part-time as a school secretary, and made sure everyone was fed and happy. The transition to widowhood felt like learning to breathe underwater. But I'm stronger than I thought I was. I discovered that after 50 years of taking care of everyone else, I actually knew quite a bit about managing life. I learned to balance my checkbook, pay bills online, and even figured out how to program that confusing universal remote Harold could never master. My condo became my sanctuary, decorated with the quilts I'd been making for decades and filled with the sound of old jazz records that Harold used to hate but I secretly loved. The Arizona heat doesn't bother me the way it does some transplants from back east. I grew up in Tucson, so the desert has always felt like home. My daily routine revolves around avoiding the worst of the afternoon sun. Mornings find me in my small garden on the patio, tending to my barrel cacti and desert marigolds. The quilting circle meets on Wednesdays at the community center, where 6 of us work on projects for the local women's shelter. Thursdays are for the book club at the library, and Fridays I volunteer at the elementary school, helping 3rd graders with their reading. My health isn't perfect, but it's manageable. I have type 2 diabetes that I control with medication and careful eating, arthritis in my hands that makes quilting challenging some days, and I see a cardiologist twice a year as a precaution after Harold's heart attack. My Medicare Advantage plan through Banner Health covers everything beautifully, which is a blessing since Harold's pension and Social Security don't leave much room for medical surprises. The loneliness was the hardest part at first. This condo that had felt cozy when Harold was here seemed enormous and empty after he died. The silence would stretch for hours, broken only by the air conditioning cycling on and off or the occasional sound of my neighbor's television through the thin walls. I started leaving the radio on all day just to have voices in the house, even if they were strangers talking about traffic and weather. That's when my family became more important than ever. My son Bobby lives in Tempe with his wife Linda and their 2 kids, Ashley and Kevin. It's only a 30-minute drive, but it might as well be across the country for how often I see them. Bobby works in information technology for a medical billing company, one of those jobs that sounds important but that I've never quite understood despite his patient explanations. Linda sells real estate part-time, mainly luxury homes in North Scottsdale, though she's always complaining about how the market isn't what it used to be. Bobby was my miracle baby, born after 3 miscarriages when I'd almost given up hope of becoming a mother. Harold and I poured all our love into raising him, maybe too much love if I'm being honest. We made sure he had everything we never did. Piano lessons and summer camps and a college education that took us 15 years to pay off. He was a sweet boy, always bringing me dandelions from the yard and helping Harold with projects in the garage. The grandchildren are adults now, which still surprises me. Ashley is 24 and works at a boutique in Scottsdale Fashion Square, always dressed like she stepped out of a magazine. Kevin is 22 and just graduated from Arizona State with a degree in business, though he seems more interested in playing video games than finding a job. They're good kids, but they inhabit a world of smartphones and social media that feels foreign to me. After Harold's funeral, Bobby promised he'd check on me regularly. For the first few months, he kept that promise. He'd call twice a weekend, visit every Sunday, usually bringing Linda and sometimes the kids. We'd sit on my patio drinking iced tea and talking about nothing in particular. Those visits were lifelines for me, connections to the outside world and reminders that I wasn't completely alone. But gradually, the visits became less frequent. Sunday dinners turned into every other Sunday, then once a month, then whenever it was convenient. The phone calls continued, but they felt different somehow, more perfunctory. Bobby would ask about my health, my medications, whether I was eating properly, but the conversations lacked the warmth they'd once had. I told myself he was busy, that adult children have their own lives to live, that I shouldn't expect too much. Linda was always polite but distant, the kind of daughter-in-law who remembers to send birthday cards but never calls just to chat. She'd compliment my quilts and ask about the book club, but I could sense her impatience, the way she'd check her phone or glance at her watch when she thought I wasn't looking. Sometimes I caught her studying my condo with an appraising eye, the way she probably looked at houses she was trying to sell. The grandchildren were even more detached. Ashley would arrive perfectly made up and spend most of the visit texting on her phone. Kevin was polite but clearly bored, answering my questions about school and his future with one-word responses. I tried to connect with them by asking about their interests, their friends, their dreams, but it felt like trying to have a conversation across a vast canyon. My sister Dorothy, who everyone calls Dot, was the one who kept me grounded during this transition. 5 years older than me and twice as sharp, Dot had been widowed 8 years earlier and lived in a similar community in Surprise, about 40 minutes away. We'd talk on the phone every other day and meet for lunch once a week at various restaurants around the valley. Dot had always been the practical one in our family, the one who could spot trouble from a mile away and wasn't afraid to speak her mind about it. They're taking advantage of your loneliness, Dot warned me one afternoon over chicken salad sandwiches at a cafe near her house. Bobby's a grown man with a family of his own. He shouldn't need his mother to solve his financial problems. I'd just told her about loaning Bobby $3,000 to help with Ashley's car payment after she'd rear-ended someone in a parking lot. The insurance deductible was high, he'd explained, and they were stretched thin with Kevin's college expenses and Linda's inconsistent real estate commissions. He's my son, I protested. Family helps family. Family doesn't take advantage, Dot replied, her gray eyes sharp behind her reading glasses. When was the last time any of them visited? Without asking for something? I couldn't answer that question, which was answer enough. Every recent visit had ended with some request, some crisis that required my financial intervention. Kevin needed help with textbooks, Ashley's rent had gone up unexpectedly, Linda's car needed major repairs. Each request was reasonable on its own, accompanied by promises to pay me back and expressions of gratitude for my generosity. But I never saw any of that money again, and the promises to pay me back were never mentioned again after the checks were cashed. I started keeping track in a small notebook, telling myself it was just so I could manage my own budget better. I called his cell phone that afternoon, my heart pounding as I waited for him to answer. "Hey Mom," he said, his voice cheerful and relaxed. "What's up?" "Bobby, I need to ask you something important," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. "Have you or anyone in your family used my Medicare card for anything?" There was a pause, just long enough to confirm my suspicions. What do you mean, Mom? Why would we use your Medicare card? I've been looking at my statements, and there are charges for medical treatment in places I've never been. Places where? Your family has taken vacations recently. Another pause, longer this time. When Bobby spoke again, his tone was different, more guarded. Mom, I think you might be confused. Maybe you're thinking of the wrong dates or mixing up your appointments. I'm not confused, I said firmly. I'm looking at charges for a clinic in Vail, Colorado, on March 15th. You and Linda were in Colorado skiing that weekend. We never used your Medicare card, Mom, Bobby said, but I could hear the strain in his voice. Maybe there's been some kind of mistake with the billing. You know how screwed up the healthcare system is. I wanted to believe him, but I'd seen too much evidence to dismiss it as a billing error. Bobby, this is serious. Medicare fraud is a federal crime. If someone is using my card illegally, I need to report it. Don't do anything hasty, Bobby said quickly. Let me look into this for you. I know someone who works in medical billing, who might be able to help figure out what's going wrong. After I hung up, I sat in my living room feeling more alone than I had since Harold died. My son was lying to me about committing crimes using my identity, and I had no idea how to handle the situation. Part of me wanted to believe there was some innocent explanation, some misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a few phone calls. But Dot's voice echoed in my head, reminding me that there are no coincidences when it comes to fraud. The evidence was too clear, the timing too perfect, the responses too evasive. My family was using me in ways I'd never imagined possible. The phone calls started the next day. First Linda, her voice dripping with concern about my confusion regarding the Medicare statements. She suggested I might be developing memory problems and offered to help me organize my medical paperwork to prevent future mix-ups. It's so easy to get dates confused, she said in that patronizing tone I'd come to recognize. Maybe you should consider letting Bobby handle more of your financial affairs. It would take the stress off you. Then Ashley called, asking casual questions about my health and whether I'd been feeling scattered lately. She mentioned how her friend's grandmother had started mixing up dates and appointments before being diagnosed with early dementia. It's nothing to be ashamed of, Grandma, she said sweetly. Lots of people your age need help keeping track of things. Kevin was more direct, calling to ask if I'd been talking to anyone about family business that wasn't really their concern. He suggested that sometimes people my age could be taken advantage of by strangers who convinced them to file false reports about their own family members. The coordinated nature of these calls was almost as disturbing as the original fraud. They were working together to gaslight me, to make me question my own perceptions and memories. They wanted me to believe I was the problem, that my age made me unreliable and confused. But their campaign to undermine my confidence had the opposite effect. The more they tried to convince me I was wrong, the more certain I became that I was right. Their desperation to discredit my concerns only confirmed that there was something significant to hide. I started documenting everything. I wrote down the exact times and dates of their phone calls, recording their exact words as best I could remember them. I made copies of all the suspicious Medicare statements and organized them by location and date. I cross-referenced their vacation photos on social media with the medical charges, creating a timeline that showed the correlation clearly. Frank noticed my distraction during our Saturday dinner date. We were at a quiet Italian restaurant near his condo, but I could barely focus on the conversation. I kept thinking about the evidence I'd compiled, wondering if I was overreacting or if the situation was as serious as it seemed. You seem troubled tonight, Frank said gently, reaching across the table to touch my hand. Is everything all right? I hesitated, unsure how much to share. We'd been dating for only a few months, and this was exactly the kind of family drama that might scare away a new relationship. But I needed someone to talk to, someone who wasn't emotionally invested in protecting my family's reputation. I think my family has been committing Medicare fraud using my information, I said quietly, surprised by how the words sounded when spoken out loud. Frank's expression grew serious as I explained what I'd discovered. He listened without interrupting, asking clarifying questions that showed he understood the complexity of the situation. This is not a small matter, he said finally. Medicare fraud is investigated by federal agents. The penalties can include significant jail time. I know, I said, feeling tears welling up. But they're my family. If I report this, I could destroy their lives. And if you don't report it, they'll destroy yours, Frank replied bluntly. This kind of fraud doesn't stop on its own. They'll keep using your card until they're caught, and when that happens, you could be viewed as an accomplice. His practical perspective was both helpful and frightening. I'd been so focused on the family dynamics that I hadn't fully considered the legal implications for myself. If this fraud continued and was eventually discovered by Medicare investigators, would anyone believe I hadn't known about it? The next morning, I called Banner Health again and spoke to their fraud investigation department. The representative I spoke with was much more serious than the customer service person had been. She explained that Medicare fraud was extremely common and that they took all reports seriously. The question had been haunting me for days. Not if you're truly a victim, which appears to be the case, Agent Mitchell assured me. But we will need your full cooperation throughout the investigation. They left me with business cards and strict instructions not to discuss the investigation with anyone except my attorney. I was to continue my normal routine but report any attempts by my family to pressure me or access my Medicare information. After they left, I sat on my patio in the desert heat, staring at my flowers and trying to process what was happening. Federal agents were investigating my son for crimes that could send him to prison. My grandchildren might be charged as accomplices. My family as I knew it was about to be destroyed, and I was the one who had set the destruction in motion. But I couldn't bring myself to regret my decision. What they had done was wrong, and the fact that they were family didn't make it less criminal. If anything, it made it worse because they had exploited the trust and love that should have been sacred. Frank called that evening to check on me, and I found myself telling him about the agent's visit despite their instructions about confidentiality. I trusted him, and I needed someone who wasn't emotionally invested in protecting my family's secrets. You did the right thing, he said firmly. I know it doesn't feel that way, but you're protecting other seniors who might be victims of similar schemes. And you're protecting yourself from being implicated in their crimes. I keep wondering if I should have handled this differently. I admitted. Maybe I should have given Bobby a chance to pay back the money and stop the fraud quietly. Maggie, Frank said gently, fraudsters don't stop because you ask them nicely. They stop when they're caught and face consequences. Your son is a middle-aged man who made deliberate choices to commit federal crimes. That's not your fault. I wanted to believe him, but the guilt was overwhelming. I'd raised Bobby to come to me with his problems, and now I was the one creating his biggest problem. Part of me still hoped there was some explanation I hadn't considered, some way this could all be resolved without destroying lives. That hope died 3 weeks later. Bobby called on a Sunday afternoon, his voice casual and friendly as if nothing had changed between us. Hey Mom, I was thinking about stopping by today. Are you free? Of course, I said, though my stomach clenched with anxiety. I hadn't heard from any of them since my conversation with the federal agents, and I'd been expecting some kind of confrontation. Bobby arrived an hour later, but he wasn't alone. Linda, Ashley, and Kevin were all with him, their faces wearing matching expressions of concern and determination. They arranged themselves around my living room like an intervention team, with Bobby taking the lead. Mom, we need to talk about these crazy accusations you've been making, Bobby began, his tone suggesting he was dealing with an unreasonable child. We've been consulting with lawyers, and they're very concerned about your mental state. My mental state is fine, I said, keeping my voice steady despite the racing of my heart. Is it? Linda challenged, pulling out a folder of documents. Because we've been looking into this Medicare situation you're so worried about, and we think you're the one who's been confused about your medical appointments. She spread papers across my coffee table, and I recognized them as copies of my Medicare statements. But these versions had been altered, with different dates and locations highlighted in ways that made the pattern of fraud less obvious. Look at this, Ashley said, pointing to one of the manipulated documents. You were in Colorado last March for your cardiology appointment, remember? Dr. Patel referred you to that specialist in Vail. I've never been to Vail, I said firmly. I see Dr. Patel here in Scottsdale, and he's never referred me to anyone in Colorado. Mom, you're confused, Kevin said gently, as if explaining something to a small child. You went to Colorado for treatment, but the altitude made you sick, so you don't remember it clearly. They were gaslighting me with remarkable coordination, using altered documents and false memories to make me question my own recollections. They'd obviously spent considerable time preparing for this confrontation, creating a narrative that painted me as a confused elderly woman who had forgotten her own medical travels. I think you need to see a doctor, Bobby said, his voice heavy with fake concern. We're worried about early-stage dementia. It would explain why you're so confused about where you've been and what medical care you've received. There's a wonderful memory care facility in Surprise, Linda added helpfully. They specialize in cases like yours, where the confusion is just beginning but might get worse. The threat was crystal clear. If I continued to pursue the fraud investigation, they would have me declared mentally incompetent and placed in a care facility. They would take control of my finances and my life, removing my ability to testify against them or make independent decisions. I'm not confused, and I'm not going to any care facility, I said, standing up from my chair. I want all of you to leave my home immediately. Mom, you're being irrational, Bobby said, his mask of concern slipping slightly to reveal the anger underneath. We're trying to help you. You're trying to silence me because you know you're guilty, I replied, surprised by the strength in my own voice. You've been using my Medicare card to get medical treatment while you're on vacation, and now you're trying to gaslight me into believing I'm crazy. That's a very serious accusation, Kevin said, and for the first time, I heard uncertainty in his voice. Do you have any proof of these claims? The federal agents seem to think I do, I said, watching their faces carefully. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Bobby's face went pale, Linda gasped audibly, and Ashley looked like she might be sick. Kevin was the only one who maintained his composure, but I could see the fear in his eyes. What federal agents? Bobby asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The Medicare Fraud Strike Force, I said calmly. They're investigating the fraudulent charges on my account, and they're very interested in the pattern of medical claims that coincide perfectly with your family vacations. You called the FBI on your own family? Ashley asked, her voice rising to near hysteria. Grandma, how could you do that to us? It was the feeling that I was being humored rather than genuinely included in their lives. My Medicare card represented more than just health insurance. It was proof of my citizenship in a system that valued me, recognition that I'd worked and contributed and earned the right to care in my later years. I'd paid into Medicare for decades, through payroll deductions when I worked at the school and through Harold's employment at the power company. It felt like something I'd earned, a promise that my government would help take care of me when I was no longer able to take care of myself. The monthly statements were reassuring in their predictability. Doctor visits, lab work, prescription coverage, all documented in neat columns with dates and amounts and explanations of benefits. I didn't understand all the medical codes and terminology, but I trusted that the system was working as intended, that the charges reflected care I'd actually received. What I didn't understand yet was that my trust was being exploited by the people closest to me, the ones who should have been protecting me instead of using me. What I didn't know was that my Medicare card had become their passport to medical care in places I'd never been, for conditions I'd never had, generating bills that someone else would eventually have to pay. The first hint that something was wrong came on a Tuesday morning in March, when I was having coffee on my patio before the day got too hot. The mail had arrived early, and among the usual collection of bills and advertisements was my monthly Medicare statement. I almost set it aside to read later, but something about the thickness of the envelope caught my attention. Inside were more pages than usual, documenting charges I didn't recognize from places I'd never been. But I didn't understand the significance yet, didn't realize that my life was about to change in ways I could never have imagined. I just knew that something felt wrong, and for the first time in years, I was going to have to trust my instincts instead of giving others the benefit of the doubt. That Medicare statement was the beginning of the end of my old life, and the first page of a story I never thought I'd have to write. The Medicare statement felt heavier in my hands than it should have. I spread the pages across my patio table, using my coffee mug to hold down the corners against the gentle morning breeze. Something was definitely wrong. There were charges listed for a clinic in Vail, Colorado, dated just 3 weeks ago. According to the paperwork, I'd received emergency treatment for altitude sickness and dehydration at a ski resort medical facility. The problem was obvious and alarming. I haven't been to Colorado in 15 years, not since Harold and I took that disastrous vacation to visit his brother in Denver. I'd gotten so sick from the altitude that we'd cut the trip short after 2 days. The very thought of high elevations makes me dizzy now. And yet here was documentation saying I'd been treated at a clinic 9,000 feet above sea level, with my Medicare card being charged for services I'd never received. I called Banner Health's customer service line, my hands shaking slightly as I dialed. The representative was polite but seemed confused by my question. She confirmed that yes, those charges were indeed on my account, and yes, they showed my Medicare number being used for treatment in Vail on March 15th. Are you sure you weren't there, Mrs. Thompson? She asked, her voice professional but slightly skeptical. Sometimes people forget shorter trips, especially if they were feeling unwell. I'm absolutely certain, I said firmly. I haven't left Arizona since my husband's funeral 4 years ago. Someone has been using my Medicare information fraudulently. The customer service representative put me on hold while she consulted with a supervisor. When she returned, her tone was more serious. They would investigate the charges and temporarily flag my account for suspicious activity. In the meantime, I should check all my recent statements carefully for any other irregularities. That's when I really started paying attention. I spread out 6 months' worth of Medicare statements on my dining room table, organizing them chronologically and reading each line item carefully. What I found made my stomach turn. There were charges from a clinic in Maui, Hawaii, for treatment of a jellyfish sting. Bills from an urgent care center in Las Vegas for food poisoning. A dermatology consultation in Miami for severe sunburn treatment. Each charge was relatively small, under $200, which is probably why I'd never noticed them before. But together, they painted a picture of someone living a much more adventurous life than I was. Someone who traveled frequently to vacation destinations and seemed prone to minor medical emergencies in exotic locations. I called Dot immediately, my voice shaking as I explained what I'd discovered. She drove over within an hour, bringing her reading glasses and her no-nonsense attitude. "This is identity theft," she said bluntly, examining the statements spread across my table. "Someone has been using your Medicare card to get medical treatment while they're traveling. The question is who?" We both knew the answer, though neither of us wanted to say it out loud. The timing of the charges coincided perfectly with conversations I'd had with Bobby's family about their various trips. Ashley had posted photos from Hawaii on Facebook in February. Kevin had gone to Las Vegas with friends for his birthday in January. Bobby and Linda had taken a weekend trip to Miami just before Christmas, calling it a much-needed getaway from the stress of the holidays. "Maybe it's a coincidence," I said weakly, but Dot gave me the look she'd been perfecting since we were children. "Margaret Elizabeth Thompson," she said, using my full name the way our mother used to when I was being particularly dense, "there are no coincidences when it comes to Medicare fraud. Someone in your family has been carrying your Medicare card and using it whenever they get sick on vacation." The implications were staggering. Not only was this illegal, but it meant that my own family had been planning these thefts for months. They'd had to obtain my Medicare information, either by copying my card or somehow accessing my account details. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision, it was a calculated scheme to defraud the government using my identity. I thought about all the times Ashley had volunteered to help me organize my purse or Linda had offered to file my medical paperwork. I remembered Kevin asking casual questions about how Medicare worked and whether there were any restrictions on where you could use it. At the time, I'd been pleased by their interest in my health and well-being. Now I realized they'd been gathering intelligence for their fraud scheme. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. This wasn't just about money, it was about trust, about the fundamental relationship between a mother and her children. They'd looked me in the eye while planning to commit crimes using my identity. They'd hugged me goodbye after visits where they'd stolen information they needed to impersonate me to medical providers. But the anger was mixed with fear. If they were discovered, would I be held responsible? Could I be prosecuted for Medicare fraud because my card had been used illegally? I'd heard horror stories about seniors losing their benefits or facing criminal charges for mistakes they didn't make. The thought of being investigated by the government, of having to prove my innocence, was terrifying. I decided to confront Bobby directly. "You did the right thing, Maggie," he said in the dream. "Bobby's not the boy we raised anymore, and that's not your fault." I woke up feeling more at peace than I had since this whole nightmare began. Harold would have supported my decision to seek justice, and knowing that gave me the strength to see this through to the end. The arrests happened on a Tuesday morning exactly 1 week later. Agent Mitchell called to let me know that Bobby, Linda, Ashley, and Kevin had all been taken into custody and charged with Medicare fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. They would be arraigned within 48 hours, and I would likely be called to testify at their eventual trial. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Sad," I answered honestly. "But not sorry." "That's normal," she said. "Family fraud cases are always the hardest because the victims love the perpetrators. But you should know that your courage in reporting this has probably prevented them from victimizing other seniors and helped us identify patterns that will protect other Medicare beneficiaries." After the call, I sat on my patio in the desert morning, watching the sun rise over the mountains in the distance. My family was gone, destroyed by their own greed and my refusal to be their victim any longer. But I was still here, still strong, still capable of building a new life on my own terms. The hardest part was over. Now I could begin the work of healing and moving forward, knowing that I had chosen justice over enabling, dignity over denial. It was a choice I would never regret, no matter how much it cost me. The morning after the arrests, my phone started ringing at 6 a.m. The first call was from a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered, I heard Bobby's voice, strained and desperate. "Mom, please, you have to drop the charges," he said without any greeting. "I'm calling from the county jail. They're saying we could get 10 years in federal prison." "I can't drop the charges, Bobby," I said quietly. "This is a federal investigation now. It's out of my hands." "But you started it," he insisted, his voice cracking. "You can stop it. You can tell them you were confused, that you made a mistake." "I wasn't confused, and I didn't make a mistake," I replied. You committed serious crimes using my identity. I won't lie to federal agents to help you escape the consequences. Mom, please," he was crying now, something I hadn't heard since he was a small boy. "Think about Ashley and Kevin. They're just kids. They don't deserve to have their lives ruined over this. They're adults, Bobby. Ashley is 24 and Kevin is 22. They're old enough to understand that using someone else's Medicare card is illegal." He hung up on me, but the calls continued throughout the day. Linda called from her cell, screaming accusations and threats before I disconnected the line. Ashley called sobbing, begging me to reconsider, promising they would never do anything like this again. Kevin's call was the most manipulative, appealing to my love for him as a grandmother and suggesting that sending them to prison would kill any chance of reconciliation. By noon, I had turned off my phone and unplugged my landline. The emotional manipulation was exhausting, and I needed space to think clearly about what came next. Dot arrived at my door that afternoon with a thermos of iced tea and her trademark determination. "I figured you might need some support today," she said, settling into my kitchen with the familiarity of decades of sisterhood. "They want me to tell the federal agents I was confused about the Medicare fraud," I told her. "They think if I recant my statement, the charges will be dropped." "That's not how federal crimes work," Dot said bluntly. "Once the government has evidence of fraud, they don't need the victim's cooperation to prosecute. They have the medical records, the false claims, and probably security footage from the clinics." She was right, of course. Agent Mitchell had explained that Medicare fraud cases were built on documentation, not victim testimony. My family's arrest wasn't dependent on my continued cooperation, though my willingness to testify would certainly strengthen the prosecution's case. "What if I'm wrong about this?" I asked, voicing the doubt that had been nagging at me since the arrests. What if there really was some innocent explanation I didn't consider? Dot gave me the look she'd perfected over 75 years of dealing with my occasional bouts of overthinking. "Margaret, they admitted to using your Medicare card during that confrontation in your living room. They admitted they'd been doing it for months. There's no innocent explanation for identity theft." She was right, but knowing something intellectually and accepting it emotionally were different things. These were people I'd loved and trusted for decades. Accepting that they deliberately victimized me required dismantling years of assumptions about who they were and what our relationships meant. The doorbell rang, interrupting my spiral of doubt. Through the peephole, I could see a woman in a business suit holding a briefcase and a badge. I opened the door to find Agent Mitchell, looking professional but concerned. "Mrs. Thompson, I wanted to check on you personally," she said. "We understand that family members of arrestees often face pressure to change their statements or refuse to cooperate with investigations. They've been calling all morning," I admitted, inviting her in. "They want me to tell you I was confused about the Medicare charges." "That's not uncommon," Agent Mitchell said, settling into my living room chair. "Family fraud cases create enormous emotional pressure on victims. But I want you to understand that your original statement isn't the only evidence we have." She opened her briefcase and pulled out several folders. "We've obtained security footage from 3 of the medical clinics where your Medicare card was used fraudulently. The footage clearly shows your family members presenting your card and identifying themselves as you to receive treatment. We'll need you to file a formal complaint," she said. "And you should also report this to Medicare directly and potentially to law enforcement, depending on how extensive the fraud appears to be." I made an appointment to meet with a Medicare fraud investigator the following week, but I decided to give Bobby one more chance to come clean. I called him that evening and asked him to come over to discuss the Medicare situation in person. He arrived the next afternoon with Linda, both of them wearing expressions of concerned bewilderment. They sat on my couch like they were visiting a confused elderly relative, speaking in the kind of gentle, slow voices people use with children or patients. "Mom, we're worried about you," Bobby began. "These accusations you're making about Medicare fraud are very serious. Are you sure you're thinking clearly about this?" I spread the Medicare statements across my coffee table, along with the timeline I'd created showing the correlation between their trips and the medical charges. The evidence was undeniable, but they maintained their innocent expressions. "This is all very interesting," Linda said, examining the documents with her real estate agent's eye for detail. "But I think you're seeing patterns that aren't really there. Correlation isn't causation, you know." "The dates match exactly," I said firmly. "These charges occurred in the exact locations where you were vacationing at the exact times you were there." "That's just coincidence," Bobby insisted. "We never used your Medicare card. We don't even have access to your Medicare information." But as he said it, his eyes flickered to my purse, which was sitting on the kitchen counter. I remembered all the times they'd offered to help me organize my wallet, all the occasions when my purse had been left unattended while they were visiting. Getting access to my Medicare card would have been simple for them. I'm going to report this to the authorities, I said, watching their faces carefully for reactions. The mask slipped, just for a moment. I saw panic flash across Bobby's features and watched Linda's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. But they recovered quickly, resuming their expressions of concerned confusion. Mom, if you file a false report about Medicare fraud, there could be serious consequences for you, Bobby said, his voice taking on a subtle threatening tone. The government doesn't like it when people waste their time with imaginary crimes. Maybe we should have you evaluated by a doctor, Linda added. Just to make sure you're not experiencing any cognitive issues that might be affecting your judgment. The threat was clear, even though it was wrapped in concern for my well-being. If I pursued this fraud investigation, they would try to have me declared mentally incompetent. They would claim that age and grief had affected my ability to think clearly, and they would use my accusations against them as evidence of paranoid delusions. After they left, I sat in my living room feeling more isolated than ever. My family was not only stealing from me but was prepared to destroy my reputation and independence to cover up their crimes. They were willing to have me declared mentally incompetent rather than admit their guilt. But their threats had revealed something important. They were scared, which meant they knew their scheme was serious and illegal. Their desperation to silence me confirmed that I was right to pursue this investigation, regardless of the personal cost. I called Dot and asked her to come over immediately. When she arrived, I showed her the Medicare statements and explained about Bobby and Linda's visit and their subtle threats. They're running scared, Dot said, her expression grim. And scared people do desperate things. You need to protect yourself, Maggie. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about the implications of what I discovered and what I needed to do next. My family had betrayed me in ways I never could have imagined, and now they were threatening to have me declared incompetent to protect themselves. But I wasn't the confused, helpless old woman they wanted everyone to believe I was. I was angry, and I was determined to see this through, no matter what it cost me. They had underestimated their victim, and that was going to be their biggest mistake. The next morning, I made the phone call that would change everything. I reported the Medicare fraud to the federal investigators, knowing that there was no going back from that decision. Whatever happened next, I was committed to seeking justice, even if it meant losing my family forever. As I waited for the investigators to call me back, I realized that I felt lighter than I had in months. For the first time since Harold died, I was taking control of my own life instead of letting others manipulate and use me. It was terrifying and liberating at the same time, and I knew that whatever came next, I would face it with my dignity intact. The call came on a Thursday morning while I was tending to my desert marigolds on the patio. I almost didn't answer, because the number was unfamiliar, but something made me wipe the soil from my hands and pick up the phone. Mrs. Thompson, this is Agent Sarah Mitchell from the Medicare Fraud Strike Force. We've reviewed your complaint and we'd like to schedule an interview as soon as possible. My heart hammered against my ribs. Until that moment, part of me had hoped this was all some terrible misunderstanding that would resolve itself quietly. But hearing the words, Fraud Strike Force, made everything brutally real. Agent Mitchell arrived at my condo 3 days later, accompanied by Agent David Park from the Department of Health and Human Services. They were younger than I'd expected, probably in their 30s, dressed in conservative business suits that made them look like insurance salespeople. But their credentials were legitimate, and their questions were sharp and thorough. We want you to know that this type of fraud is more common than most people realize, Agent Mitchell said, settling into my living room chair with a thick folder of documents. Family members often have the easiest access to Medicare information, and they frequently justify their actions by telling themselves they're only borrowing the coverage temporarily. But it's still illegal, Agent Park added firmly. Medicare fraud costs taxpayers billions of dollars annually, and we prosecute every case we can build. They walked me through each suspicious charge, asking detailed questions about my whereabouts, on specific dates and whether I'd ever given anyone permission to use my Medicare information. I showed them the timeline I'd created, matching the fraudulent charges to my family's vacation photos from social media. This is excellent documentation, Agent Mitchell said, examining my organized evidence. You've essentially built half our case for us. What happens now? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. We conduct a full investigation, Agent Park explained. We'll interview the medical providers who filed these claims, review security footage if it exists, and examine financial records. If we find evidence of deliberate fraud, we'll present the case to federal prosecutors. Will I get in trouble? You did this to yourselves, I replied. I didn't commit Medicare fraud. I didn't steal anyone's identity. I didn't lie to medical providers or file false insurance claims. Linda stood up abruptly, her real estate agent politeness finally cracking completely. "You vindictive old bitch," she snarled. "We've been supporting you for years, helping you with everything, and this is how you repay us? Supporting me?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You've been draining my savings account and using my Medicare card like your personal insurance policy. The only thing you've been supporting is your own lifestyle. We never asked you for anything we didn't need," Bobby said defensively, but his voice lacked conviction. "You asked me for money constantly," I replied. "And when I wasn't giving you enough cash, you decided to start stealing government benefits using my identity." "It wasn't stealing," Kevin protested. "It was just borrowing. We were going to pay it back." "Pay back Medicare?" I asked incredulously. "You can't pay back fraudulent insurance claims, Kevin. That's not how it works." The truth was finally coming out, their careful facade crumbling under the pressure of being discovered. They were admitting to the fraud while simultaneously trying to minimize its seriousness, as if borrowing Medicare benefits was equivalent to borrowing a cup of sugar. "You have no idea what you've done," Bobby said, his voice turning cold and threatening. "If we get arrested, if we go to prison, that's on you. You could have handled this quietly, but instead you chose to destroy your own family." "I didn't destroy anything," I said firmly. "You destroyed our family the moment you decided to use me as a victim instead of loving me as a mother." "We do love you," Ashley said, tears streaming down her face. "We never meant to hurt you." "Yes, you did," I replied sadly. "You meant to hurt me financially, you meant to use my trust against me, and when I discovered your crimes, you meant to have me declared incompetent to silence me. Everything you've done has been calculated to hurt me for your own benefit." Linda was pacing now, her composure completely gone. "This is insane. Over what? A few $100s in medical bills? You're going to send your own son to federal prison over pocket change?" "It's not about the money," I said, though I knew she would never understand. "It's about trust, and respect, and treating family members like human beings instead of resources to be exploited." "The feds don't care about your feelings," Bobby said bitterly. "They just want to make arrests and get convictions. You've given them everything they need to destroy all of us." He was probably right about that. The evidence was overwhelming, and their admissions during this confrontation would likely seal their fate if the agents had been listening somehow. But I felt no satisfaction in their fear, only a deep sadness for what our family had become. "You need to get lawyers," I said quietly. "Good ones. And you need to stop committing crimes immediately." "What's that supposed to mean?" Linda asked suspiciously. "It means stop using my Medicare card," I said bluntly. "Stop filing false claims, stop using my identity, stop committing federal crimes. If you're caught doing it again after this investigation started, the penalties will be much worse." "We stopped weeks ago," Kevin admitted, confirming that they had indeed been guilty all along. After they left, I sat in my living room surrounded by the altered Medicare documents they'd brought to gaslight me with. Their desperation had been palpable, their fear infectious. But underneath my sadness and anxiety, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of standing up for myself. They had underestimated me, treating me like a helpless old woman who could be manipulated and silenced. But I had found my voice and my strength, and I had used both to protect myself and seek justice. Whatever happened next, I had done the right thing. The phone rang that evening, and I recognized Agent Mitchell's number. "Mrs. Thompson, we've completed the initial phase of our investigation, and we have enough evidence to proceed with charges. We'll need you to come in for a formal statement tomorrow." "Will they be arrested?" I asked. "That's up to the prosecutors. But yes, arrests are likely within the next few days." After I hung up, I called Dot to tell her what was happening. She listened without interrupting, then sighed deeply. "I'm proud of you, Maggie," she said finally. "I know this isn't easy, but you're doing what needs to be done." "Am I?" I asked, suddenly uncertain again. "They're going to go to prison because of me." "They're going to go to prison because they committed federal crimes," Dot corrected firmly. "You didn't make them steal from Medicare. You didn't make them use your identity fraudulently. You just refused to let them get away with it." That night, I dreamed about Harold for the first time in months. In the dream, he was sitting in his favorite chair, reading the newspaper like he used to every morning. When I told him about what Bobby had done, he looked up from his paper with those kind brown eyes I'd loved for so many years. She showed me still images printed from the security cameras. There was Ashley at a clinic in Maui, signing paperwork with my name. Kevin at an urgent care center in Las Vegas, handing over what was clearly my Medicare card to a receptionist. Bobby and Linda at a ski resort medical facility in Colorado, Bobby filling out forms while Linda waited nearby. The medical staff at these facilities have confirmed that the people in these images are the same individuals who received treatment. Using your Medicare information, Agent Mitchell continued. We also have financial records showing that your family members were in these locations on the dates the fraudulent claims were filed. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Whatever doubts I'd had about the strength of the case against them evaporated as I looked at the clear photographic proof of their crimes. What happens now? I asked. They'll be arraigned tomorrow, and then they'll have the opportunity to negotiate plea deals with the prosecutors, Agent Mitchell explained. Given the amount of evidence against them, most defendants in similar cases choose to plead guilty rather than go to trial. Will I have to testify? Possibly, though it may not be necessary if they plead guilty. But Mrs. Thompson, I want you to know that you've done nothing wrong here. You were the victim of a deliberate scheme to defraud the federal government using your identity. Your decision to report this fraud was courageous and correct. After she left, I sat in my living room looking at the security camera photos she'd left with me. The images were devastating not just as evidence of crimes, but as proof of how calculated and deliberate their deception had been. They hadn't stumbled into Medicare fraud accidentally, they'd planned it carefully, using my trust and access to commit federal felonies. That evening, Frank came over with takeout from our favorite Chinese restaurant. He'd been wonderful throughout this ordeal, offering practical support without trying to influence my decisions about how to handle the situation. How are you holding up? He asked as we unpacked containers of sweet and sour chicken and fried rice. I feel like I've been living with strangers for years without realizing it, I said. The people who were arrested yesterday aren't the family I thought I knew. Maybe they never were, Frank suggested gently. Sometimes people show us who they want us to see, not who they really are. And sometimes it takes a crisis to reveal someone's true character. I keep thinking about all the signs I missed, I admitted. All the times they asked for money, all the times they seemed more interested in my finances than my well-being. How did I not see what was happening? Because you love them, Frank said simply. Love makes us want to believe the best about people, even when evidence suggests otherwise. That's not a weakness, Maggie. That's what makes you a good person. The next few days passed in a blur of legal proceedings and media attention. The arrests had been reported in the local news, with headlines about Medicare fraud and family betrayal that made me cringe every time I saw them. My quiet life in the retirement community was suddenly the subject of gossip and speculation from neighbors who'd previously barely acknowledged my existence. Some of the attention was supportive. Several neighbors stopped by to express their admiration for my courage in reporting the fraud. The president of the Homeowners Association called to assure me that the community stood behind me and appreciated my efforts to protect Medicare benefits for all seniors. But there was negative attention too. A few people seemed to think I should have handled the situation privately within the family, that involving federal agents was an overreaction that would destroy innocent lives. One neighbor actually had the audacity to suggest that I was being vindictive toward my family because of loneliness and grief. The arraignment was scheduled for Thursday morning, and Agent Mitchell asked if I wanted to attend. I decided I did, partly for closure and partly because I wanted to see how Bobby and the others looked when they faced the formal charges against them. The federal courthouse in downtown Phoenix was an imposing building with security screening and marble corridors that echoed with the footsteps of attorneys and defendants. I sat in the gallery with Agent Mitchell, watching as my family was led into the courtroom in orange jail uniforms and handcuffs. They looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of their circumstances. Bobby's usually confident demeanor was replaced by a nervous humility I'd never seen before. Linda kept her eyes down, avoiding contact with anyone in the courtroom. Ashley and Kevin looked young and scared, finally understanding perhaps that their actions had serious consequences. The charges were read aloud by the prosecutor, a stern woman in her 40s who spoke with the authority of someone accustomed to dealing with federal crimes. Medicare fraud, identity theft, conspiracy to defraud the United States government. Each count carried potential sentences of years in federal prison. Their attorneys entered not guilty pleas, a formality that everyone in the courtroom understood was temporary. The evidence against them was too strong for this case to go to trial. Plea negotiations would begin immediately, with the goal of reaching agreements that would result in guilty pleas and reduced sentences. Bobby looked directly at me for the first time during the hearing, his eyes pleading for some sign of forgiveness or support. But I kept my expression neutral, unwilling to give him false hope that I would somehow rescue him from the consequences of his choices. After the arraignment, I met with the prosecutor to discuss my role in any potential plea negotiations. She explained that my impact statement would be important in determining the sentences my family members received. The judge will want to understand how this fraud affected you personally, she said. Not just financially, but emotionally and psychologically. Your perspective as the victim will influence whether they receive the minimum or maximum sentences allowed under their plea agreements. I spent the weekend writing my impact statement, trying to articulate the complex emotions of being victimized by people I'd loved and trusted. It wasn't just about the money they'd stolen or the illegal use of my Medicare benefits. It was about the fundamental betrayal of family bonds, the destruction of relationships I'd treasured, and the violation of trust that had taken me years to build after Harold's death. The most difficult part was acknowledging how their actions had forced me to question my own judgment and worth. For months after discovering the fraud, I'd wondered if I was somehow to blame, if my loneliness and need for family connection had made me an easy target. Their gaslighting attempts had been designed to exploit exactly those insecurities. But writing this statement also helped me recognize how much I'd grown through this ordeal. I'd found the courage to stand up for myself, to seek justice despite enormous emotional pressure to remain silent. I discovered that I was stronger and more resilient than I'd believed possible. Monday morning brought a call from Bobby's attorney, requesting a meeting to discuss a possible resolution of the case. He wanted to know if I would be willing to support reduced sentences for my family members in exchange for full restitution and community service. My clients are prepared to plead guilty to all charges, he said during our phone conversation. They understand they've committed serious crimes, and they want to make amends. But they're hoping Mrs. Thompson might consider advocating for mercy given their family relationship. I agreed to meet with him, not because I was inclined to advocate for leniency, but because I wanted to understand exactly what kind of restitution they were proposing. If they were truly ready to take responsibility for their actions, I was willing to listen. The meeting was held at the attorney's office in downtown Scottsdale, a modern building with glass walls and expensive furniture that suggested successful practice in white-collar criminal defense. Bobby's lawyer was a smooth-talking man in his 50s who specialized in making wealthy people's problems disappear as quietly as possible. Your family members have asked me to express their deep remorse for what they've done, he began, as if he were delivering a rehearsed speech. They understand they've violated your trust and committed serious crimes. They're prepared to make full financial restitution for all fraudulent Medicare charges and pay additional compensation for the emotional distress they've caused. How much are we talking about? I asked. He consulted his notes. The fraudulent Medicare charges total approximately $8,000. They're prepared to pay that amount back to Medicare, plus an additional $10,000 to you personally as compensation for your suffering. And in exchange? They're hoping you'll write a letter to the judge explaining that you've forgiven them and requesting minimal prison sentences. With your support, they might receive probation and community service instead of federal incarceration. I considered his proposal carefully. $18,000 was significant money for someone on my fixed income. But it felt like another attempt to buy their way out of consequences, to use their financial resources to minimize the impact of their crimes. I need time to think about this, I said finally. Of course, he replied, handing me his business card. But I should mention that this offer is contingent on your cooperation. If you continue to support maximum prosecution, they'll be less inclined to offer financial compensation beyond what's legally required. The threat was subtle but clear. If I didn't help them minimize their sentences, they wouldn't voluntarily pay me any compensation beyond the restitution required by law. They were still trying to manipulate me, still attempting to use money to control my decisions. That evening, I called Agent Mitchell to discuss the attorney's proposal. She listened without comment as I explained the offer and my conflicted feelings about it. What do you think I should do? I asked. That's not my decision to make, she said carefully. But I can tell you that in my experience, family fraud cases that end with minimal consequences often repeat themselves. People who are willing to victimize family members once rarely stop unless they face serious penalties. You think they'll do this again? I think they'll do whatever they believe they can get away with, she said bluntly. And if they face minimal consequences for federal crimes, they might conclude they can get away with quite a lot. After we hung up, I sat on my patio in the desert evening, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of orange and purple. The decision about how to respond to the plea offer felt enormous, with the power to determine not just my family's future, but my own sense of justice and closure. I thought about Harold and what he would have wanted me to do. He'd always believed in accountability, in facing the consequences of your actions with dignity and courage. He wouldn't have wanted me to be bought off with guilt money, wouldn't have wanted me to enable behavior that hurt other people. By morning, I'd made my decision. I called the attorney and declined his offer. I won't be advocating for reduced sentences, I told him. Your clients committed serious crimes against me and against the federal government. They need to face the full consequences of their choices. "That's unfortunate," he said, his tone cooling noticeably. "I hope you won't regret this decision. When you see how it affects your grandchildren's futures." "I regret that my grandchildren chose to participate in federal crimes," I replied. "But I don't regret holding them accountable for those choices." The plea negotiations continued without my support, and within 2 weeks, all 4 family members had entered guilty pleas to reduced charges. Bobby and Linda received 18-month federal prison sentences, while Ashley and Kevin received 1 year each. All of them would serve their time in minimum security facilities, followed by supervised probation and community service. They were also ordered to pay full restitution to Medicare and find additional amounts that would strain their finances for years to come. The judge made it clear during sentencing that only their cooperation and first offender status had saved them from much harsher penalties. I attended the sentencing hearing, sitting in the gallery as my family learned their fate. When given the opportunity to address the court, Bobby finally offered what seemed like a genuine apology, acknowledging that he'd betrayed my trust and violated the values I'd tried to teach him. "I'm ashamed of what I've done," he said, his voice barely audible in the quiet courtroom. "My mother raised me to be better than this, and I failed her and myself. I hope someday I can earn her forgiveness, but I understand if that's not possible." It was the first time since this ordeal began that he'd taken full responsibility without making excuses or trying to minimize his actions. Whether it was genuine remorse or calculated performance for the judge's benefit, I couldn't say. But it was what I needed to hear from him. After the sentencing, I walked out of the courthouse into the bright Arizona sunshine, feeling lighter than I had in months. Justice had been served, accountability had been enforced, and I could finally begin the process of rebuilding my life without the weight of family betrayal crushing my spirit. The chapter of my life that included Bobby, Linda, Ashley, and Kevin was over. Whatever came next would be built on honesty, respect, and genuine relationships rather than manipulation and exploitation. For the first time in years, I was completely free to choose my own path forward. 3 months after the sentencing, I received my first letter from prison. It arrived on a Tuesday morning with the rest of my mail, the envelope marked with Bobby's name and a federal correctional facility return address in Florence, Arizona. I stared at it for a long time before opening it, unsure whether I was ready to hear what he had to say. The letter was handwritten on plain white paper, his familiar penmanship somehow looking smaller and more careful than I remembered. He wrote about the daily routine of prison life, the job he'd been assigned in the library, and the anger management classes he was required to attend. But most of the letter was an apology, longer and more detailed than anything he'd said during the court proceedings. "I've had time to think about what I did to you," he wrote, "and I'm beginning to understand how much damage I caused. Not just the money, but the trust. I know I can't undo what happened, but I want you to know that I'm trying to become the person you raised me to be. The person Dad would have been proud of." I read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and put it in my desk drawer. I wasn't ready to respond, wasn't sure I ever would be, but something about his words felt different from his previous attempts at manipulation. Maybe prison had given him perspective, or maybe he was just getting better at saying what he thought I wanted to hear. During one of our weekly lunches, she raised a subject we'd been avoiding since the court proceedings ended. "Have you thought about what you'll do if they try to contact you when they get out?" she asked over grilled fish at our favorite restaurant. "Bobby's already written to me," I admitted, telling her about the letter I'd received from prison. "Are you going to write back?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "Part of me wants to believe he's genuinely changed, but part of me thinks this might just be another manipulation." "Trust your instincts," advised, echoing the advice I'd given Elena. "You've earned the right to protect yourself, even from family members who claim they've changed." Fall brought cooler temperatures and the return of comfortable outdoor activities. Frank and I began taking longer walks in the desert preserve near my community, hiking trails that wound through stands of barrel cacti and Palo Verde trees. The physical activity was good for my diabetes management, but the emotional benefits were even more significant. There was something healing about the desert landscape, with its harsh beauty and resilient plant life. The cacti had adapted to extreme conditions by developing protective spines and water storage capabilities, surviving and even thriving in an environment that would kill less adaptable species. I saw parallels to my own situation, finding ways to protect myself while still remaining open to genuine connection and growth. The anniversary of Harold's death passed quietly, marked by a visit to his grave and an evening of looking through photo albums. But for the first time since his passing, the sadness wasn't overwhelming. I missed him terribly and always would, but I was no longer defined by my widowhood. I was building a life that honored our marriage while embracing my current reality as an independent woman. Christmas approached with none of the anxiety that had characterized previous holidays. I wouldn't be hosting family dinners or worrying about gift expenses that strained my budget. Instead, Frank and I planned a quiet celebration, exchanging simple gifts and attending Christmas Eve service at the community chapel. I received Christmas cards from Bobby, Linda, Ashley, and Kevin, each containing brief messages about missing me and hoping for reconciliation. The cards went into my desk drawer with Bobby's letter, acknowledgments of their attempts at contact but not commitments to respond. "Do you miss them?" Frank asked on Christmas morning as we shared coffee and homemade cinnamon rolls on my patio. "I miss who I thought they were," I said after considering the question carefully. "I miss the family I believed I had. But I don't miss the stress, the manipulation, or the constant feeling that I was being used." "That's a healthy distinction," he said, reaching over to squeeze my hand. The new year brought unexpected news. Agent Mitchell called to inform me that my case had been selected as part of a Medicare fraud awareness campaign. The federal government wanted to use my story, with identifying details changed, to educate other seniors about family exploitation and encourage reporting of suspected fraud. "Your willingness to come forward prevented additional crimes and helped us identify patterns that protect other Medicare beneficiaries," she explained. "Would you be willing to participate in some educational materials?" I agreed to help, seeing it as an opportunity to support other seniors who might be facing similar situations. The awareness campaign included brochures, online resources, and even a short documentary featuring interviews with fraud victims and investigators. Participating in the documentary was emotionally challenging but ultimately empowering. Telling my story to a wider audience felt like reclaiming my narrative from those who had tried to silence me. The filmmaker was respectful and sensitive, focusing on the educational aspects rather than sensationalizing the family drama. When the documentary premiered at a senior center in Phoenix, I attended with Frank and Dot. Watching my story on screen, told with dignity and respect, felt like a form of closure I hadn't realized I needed. Several audience members approached me afterward to share their own experiences with family exploitation and to thank me for speaking out. Spring returned with its familiar renewal of desert life. My patio garden was more elaborate now, featuring a variety of drought-resistant plants that attracted hummingbirds and butterflies. I'd learned to appreciate the subtle beauty of desert landscaping, finding peace in the rhythm of seasonal changes that had seemed harsh when I first moved to Arizona. Bobby was scheduled for release in 6 months, with Linda following 3 months later. Ashley and Kevin had completed their sentences and were rebuilding their lives under probation supervision. I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that they were all living in different locations, their family unit as fractured as their relationship with me. The knowledge of their impending release didn't cause the anxiety I might have expected. I felt prepared to handle whatever contact they might attempt, confident in my ability to maintain boundaries and protect the life I'd built. Whether they had genuinely changed or were simply better at hiding their true motivations, I would be ready either way. My relationship with Frank had deepened into something that felt both comfortable and exciting. We discussed the possibility of moving in together, but neither of us felt rushed to make that decision. We were content with our current arrangement, maintaining separate homes while sharing increasingly more time and experiences. "I never thought I'd find love again at this age," I told him one evening as we watched the stars from his patio. "Maybe that's why it's so special," he replied. "We're choosing each other without desperation or need, just because we genuinely enjoy being together." That distinction felt important. Unlike my previous family relationships, which had been based on obligation and manipulation, my connection with Frank was based on mutual respect and genuine affection. We enhanced each other's lives without trying to control or exploit each other. As summer approached again, marking nearly a year since my family's sentencing, I reflected on how completely my life had changed. I was healthier, happier, and more financially secure than I'd been in years. I had genuine friendships, creative fulfillment, and a romantic relationship that brought joy rather than stress. Most importantly, I had learned to value myself independently of how others treated me. My worth wasn't determined by my usefulness to family members or my willingness to enable their poor choices. I was valuable simply because I was a human being deserving of respect and dignity. The Medicare fraud that had initially devastated me had ultimately set me free, by forcing me to confront the reality of my family relationships and take action. To protect myself, it had given me the opportunity to build an authentic life based on my own values and choices. I still kept Bobby's letter in my desk drawer, along with the Christmas cards and occasional updates from the prison system. Someday I might be ready to respond, to explore whether genuine reconciliation was possible. But that decision would be made on my timeline, according to my needs and comfort level. For now, I was content with the life I'd created. At 73, I was finally living for myself, painting my days in colors of my own choosing and building relationships based on honesty and mutual respect. The future stretched ahead with possibilities I was excited to explore, adventures I was eager to experience, and connections I was ready to nurture. The woman who had once defined herself through her relationships with others had discovered that she was quite remarkable on her own. And that discovery had made all the pain worthwhile. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. Either way, I would take my time deciding whether to write back. The truth was, I'd been thriving in the months since their sentencing. Without the constant stress of family manipulation and financial exploitation, I'd rediscovered parts of myself that had been dormant for years. My art had improved dramatically as I poured my emotions into watercolor landscapes that captured the stark beauty of the Arizona desert. The quilting circle had become more than just a hobby. I was now teaching advanced techniques to newer members and organizing charity projects that gave me a sense of purpose beyond my own survival. Frank had become a steady presence in my life, our relationship deepening naturally without the pressure and interference I'd experienced during my family's scheme. We'd taken weekend trips to Sedona and Flagstaff, exploring parts of Arizona I'd never seen despite living here most of my life. He understood my need for independence and didn't try to rush me into decisions I wasn't ready to make. "You're different now," he told me one evening as we watched the sunset from my patio. "More confident. More yourself, if that makes sense." It did make sense. For years, I'd been defining myself through my relationships with others, particularly my family. I was Bobby's mother, Ashley, and Kevin's grandmother, Harold's widow. But now I was simply Maggie Thompson, and I was discovering that I actually liked the person I was when I wasn't trying to please or support people who saw me primarily as a resource. The financial freedom was remarkable too. Without the constant drain of family requests and emergencies, my savings had stabilized and even begun to grow again. I'd been able to afford small luxuries that I'd denied myself for years, like the premium cable package that included classic movie channels and a weekly housekeeping service that gave me more time for activities I enjoyed. More importantly, I'd learned to say no without guilt. When the mailman mentioned that his daughter was struggling with college expenses, I expressed sympathy but didn't offer money. When a neighbor hinted about needing help with her property taxes, I changed the subject instead of reaching for my checkbook. The difference between genuine friendship and exploitation had become crystal clear, and I was no longer willing to blur those lines. Dr. Rodriguez had noticed the change during my quarterly diabetes checkup. "Your blood pressure is better than it's been in years," he told me, reviewing my test results. "Whatever you're doing differently, keep it up." What I was doing differently was living without chronic stress and anxiety. The hypervigilance that had characterized my interactions with Bobby's family was gone, replaced by a calm confidence in my ability to handle whatever challenges came my way. I slept better, ate more regularly, and found myself looking forward to each day instead of simply enduring it. The community center had offered me a position teaching watercolor classes to other seniors, a part-time job that provided both income and social connection. My students were enthusiastic learners who appreciated my patience and encouragement, reminding me why I'd enjoyed working with children during my years as a school secretary. Teaching gave me a sense of contribution and purpose that had been missing since Harold's death. One of my students was Elena Rodriguez, a 70-year-old former nurse whose husband had died the previous year. We'd bonded over our shared experience of widowhood and our mutual love of desert landscapes. Elena had a sharp wit and an irreverent sense of humor that made our painting sessions feel more like therapy than instruction. "My kids keep trying to manage my money," she told me one afternoon as we worked on a particularly challenging sky technique. "They want me to give them power of attorney just in case something happens. But I've seen what happens when families get control of seniors' finances." "Trust your instincts," I advised, thinking about my own experience. "If something feels wrong, it probably is." Elena nodded thoughtfully. "My grandmother used to say that family members who want to help with your money are usually more interested in the money than the help." The wisdom in that observation struck me deeply. It perfectly captured what I'd learned about the difference between genuine care and self-interested manipulation. People who truly want to help you find ways to support your independence, not undermine it. Spring brought news that Ashley had been released early from prison for good behavior. She'd served 10 months of her 1-year sentence and was now living in a halfway house in Tempe while completing her supervised probation. Part of her probation requirements included community service at a senior center, helping elderly residents with technology and social activities. The irony wasn't lost on me. The young woman who had helped steal from her own grandmother was now required to serve other grandmothers as part of her rehabilitation. I wondered if the experience was teaching her anything about the value and dignity of older people, or if she was simply counting down the days until her probation ended. I received a message through the Federal Probation Office asking if I would be willing to participate in a restorative justice meeting with Ashley. The probation officer explained that these meetings sometimes helped both victims and offenders find closure and understanding, but emphasized that my participation was entirely voluntary. I declined the meeting. I wasn't ready to face Ashley. Wasn't sure I ever would be. The anger had faded, replaced by sadness and disappointment, but I didn't see how a supervised conversation would benefit either of us. Some wounds needed time to heal, and some relationships couldn't be repaired simply because someone wanted them to be. Frank supported my decision, as he had supported all my choices throughout this ordeal. "You don't owe anyone forgiveness on their timeline," he said. "If you ever decide you want to reconnect with them, it should be because you're ready, not because they are." Summer arrived with its usual intensity, driving most outdoor activities indoors during the hottest parts of the day. I developed a routine of early morning painting sessions on my patio, followed by indoor activities during the afternoon heat. The watercolor classes moved to the air-conditioned community center, where we worked on techniques for capturing the subtle colors of desert light. My art had evolved beyond simple landscape studies to more complex emotional expressions. I was painting my feelings about betrayal, healing, and renewal in abstract forms that surprised me with their intensity. Several pieces had been selected for display in a gallery show featuring local senior artists, my first public exhibition since taking up painting seriously. The opening reception was held on a Friday evening at a gallery in Old Town Scottsdale. Frank accompanied me, looking distinguished in a navy blazer and helping me hang my paintings in the assigned spaces. Seeing my work displayed professionally, with small cards bearing my name and artistic statement, felt like a form of validation I hadn't realized I'd been seeking. "These paintings tell a story," said Maria Santos, an art critic for the local newspaper who was reviewing the show. "There's a journey from darkness to light, from constraint to freedom." What inspired this series? I found myself telling her about my experience with family betrayal and the process of rebuilding my life. Afterward, she listened with the focused attention of someone accustomed to finding meaning in artistic expression. "Art is healing," she said, making notes in her small notebook. "It's a powerful theme, especially for seniors who often face unique challenges related to independence and family relationships." Her review, published the following week, described my paintings as raw and honest explorations of resilience in later life, and praised my fearless examination of family dynamics and personal empowerment. The review brought several inquiries from potential buyers, something I hadn't expected when I agreed to participate in the show. Selling my art felt like another form of independence, proof that I could create value through my own efforts rather than simply managing resources inherited from my marriage or accumulated through decades of careful saving. The money wasn't significant, but the psychological impact was enormous. Dot had been watching my transformation with the satisfaction of someone who had always believed in my strength.